I shall give the floor now to Ms. Namira Negm. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Court, it's an honor to appear before you on behalf of the State of Palestine to address Israel's racial discrimination, persecution, and apartheid against the Palestinian people. Starting from the Nakba of 1948 until now, Israel has adopted discriminatory legislation and measures by which it has established a deeply entrenched system of racial discrimination against Palestinians, subjugating them to Israeli domination and denying their fundamental rights. Discrimination against the Palestinian people is as integral to Israel's prolonged occupation as is the annexation and colonization of the Palestinian territory. They are inextricable parts of the same whole and feed off each other. The UN Special Rapporteur has explained, and I quote, "At the heart of the settler colonial project of Israel is a comprehensive dual legal and political system that provides comprehensive rights and living conditions for the Jewish Israeli settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, while imposing upon the Palestinians military rule and control without any of the basic protections of international humanitarian and human rights law," end of quote. In the OPT, Israeli civilian laws apply extraterritorially to illegal settlers, while draconian Israeli military laws apply to the Palestinian population on the sole basis of national or ethnic origin. Using a toolbox of population control and inhumane acts amounting to aggravated forms of racial discrimination, Israel restricts every aspect of Palestinians' life, from birth to death, resulting in manifest human rights violations and an overt system of repression and persecution. Treated as a burden and a demographic threat, Palestinians' rights to life, liberty, and their fundamental freedoms are systematically denied. In East Jerusalem, by revoking thousands of residential permits, Israel has transformed the Palestinians with deep ancestral roots into temporary residents who can lose that residency and the right to live in their city at any moment. Through indiscriminate killing, summary execution, mass arbitrary arrest, torture, forced displacement, settler violence, movement restrictions and blockades, Israel subjects Palestinians to inhumane life conditions and untold human indignities, affecting the fate of every man, woman, and child under its control. For Israel, Palestinians are by definition guilty. Hence, it comes as no surprise that the conviction rate for Palestinians held before Israeli military courts stands at 99%. In the words of the Special Rapporteur, and I quote, "Israel's all-encompassing criminalization shows that the military legislation, rather than safeguarding security, renders every single Palestinian potentially subject to imprisonment for ordinary acts of life," end of quote. By contrast, despite the call by the Security Council for Israel to disarm the settlers, their violence continues, aided and abetted by the Israeli government and military. This is part and parcel of this Israeli domination and discrimination enterprise. Settlers are rarely, if ever, prosecuted for crimes against Palestinians, ravaging them with absolute impunity. Even some states, friendly to Israel have now decided to sanction some of the violent settlers themselves, as Israel fails to do so. Palestinians and Palestinians only endure horrific levels of extensive human and material losses, including home demolitions enforced as collective punishment. All of this has created a coercive environment that facilitates Israel's forcible displacement of Palestinians. As described by the Special Rapporteur, and I quote, "Collective punishment is an inflamed scar that runs across the entire Israeli occupation of Palestine. Notwithstanding numerous resolutions, reports, and reminders critical of its use, Israel continues to rely upon collective punishment as a prominent instrument in its coercive toolbox of population control. The logic of collective punishment has been to project domination in order to subdue a subjugated population through inflicting a steep price for its resistance to alien rule. In Gaza, this collective punishment has reached unbearable levels, hermetically sealed from the outside world by 17-year air, land, and sea blockade, with no end in sight. The situation in Gaza was described as early as 2016 by the Secretary General as collective punishment for which there must be accountability. In the absence of accountability, Gaza is besieged and bombed. Massacres perpetrated for more than 140 days now, and nearly the entire population forcibly displaced and at risk of perishing. Mr. President, this prolonged repressive regime has dehumanized Palestinians, denying them the right to life, the right to safety, the right to even exist, while confining and fragmenting them and their territory. The court is not facing isolated or individual acts violating Palestinian human rights, but rather the cumulative effect of systematic policies undoubtedly constituting a pattern of racial discrimination. Members of the court, the policies and practice of Israel amount to segregation, with the existence in the occupied Palestinian territory of two entirely separate legal systems. These are not my words. These are the words of the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, tasked by more than 180 states to fight the scourge of racial discrimination. Likewise, the UN International Commission of Inquiry has described the situation in the OPT as legal regime of segregation. When it comes to determining that a measured policy or practice disproportionately affects a group, this court attributes considerable weight to reports of several UN organs and monitoring bodies and to the constant practice of independent treaty bodies. The findings of independent treaty bodies are a fortiori to be ascribed great weight when their findings are shared by the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, special rapporteurs, as well as by almost all the participants in the present proceedings. Members of the court, Israel's occupation has been replete with systematic exclusions and restrictions adopted with the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights. As noted by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, and I quote, "The political system of entrenched rule in the occupied Palestinian territory that endows one racial, national, ethnic group with substantial rights, benefits, and privileges, while intentionally subjugating another group to live behind walls and checkpoints and under a permanent military rule. Sans droit, sans égalité, sans dignité.
Without right, without equality, without dignity.
Prevailing evidentiary standard for the existence of apartheid. Apartheid exists in the occupied Palestinian territory. 20 participant states expressly hold the same position, including victims of apartheid, South Africa and Namibia. As all states parties to the CERD, Israel is under obligation to particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid. Undoubtedly, apartheid falls within the scope of discriminatory measures referred to in the UNGA resolution requesting this advisory opinion. This court, as early as 1971 in its Namibia opinion, also confirmed that apartheid amounts to a flagrant violation of the purposes and principles of the Charter. Further, the ILC has listed the prohibition of apartheid as a preemptory norm, permitting no derogation. Applying the definition of apartheid, which reflects customary law, in both the 1973 Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, Israel's policies and practices in the OPT meet the evidentiary standards for the existence of apartheid. First, the existence of two or more different racial groups is present. International law determines racial groups by the subjective perception of the group that it has a separate identity. Judged by this standard, two distinct separate racial groups coexist in Palestine, namely the indigenous Palestinian population and Israeli Jews. Second, the establishment of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another undoubtedly exists. As evidenced in the State of Palestine's written statement, Israel has in purpose and in effect elaborated through laws, military courts, violence, discriminatory zoning and planning and collective punishment a system to subjugate Palestinians. They are confined in space and rights. They travel on segregated roads, a phenomenon that even apartheid South Africa never knew. Third, the commission of inhumane acts is endemic. Israel subjects the Palestinians at unprecedented levels to inhumane acts as defined by these two conventions. Such inhumane acts include murder, forcible population transfer, massive arbitrary arrest, imprisonment, and torture. And while the occupation continues, they are becoming more egregious every year. Finally, the inhumane acts are committed with the purpose of maintaining the apartheid regime, and by it, maintaining permanently Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territory. As was shown by Mr. Reichler, the statements of Israel's highest government officials evincing Israel's determination to dislocate the Palestinian population, annex its territory, and maintain its system of colonial settlement all attest to Israel's intention to maintain an apartheid-based occupation regime permanently. In July 2014, Israel's then Minister of Justice declared, and I quote, "What's so horrifying about understanding that the entire Palestinian population is the enemy? They are all enemy combatants, and their blood shall be on all their heads. They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. End of quote. Tragically, this is just one of the many dehumanizing descriptions by Israeli officials of Palestinian children. Snakes. Snakes, Mr. President. For all the above reasons, the State of Palestine requests the court to declare that Israel's discriminatory practices against the Palestinian people are tantamount to apartheid, which this court defined in its 1971 advisory opinion on Namibia as distinctions, exclusions, restrictions, and limitations exclusively based on grounds of race, color or descent or national or ethnic origin, which constitute a denial of fundamental human rights. This actually reflects the Palestinian reality. Mr. President, members of the court, 47 United Nations experts have declared that if the occupation is not brought to an end, and I quote, what would be left of the West Bank would be a Palestinian Bantustan, islands of disconnected land completely surrounded by Israel and with no territorial connection to the outside world, and would be the crystallization of an already unjust reality. Two peoples living in the same space, ruled by the same state, but with profoundly unequal rights. This is a vision of a 21st century apartheid. This is apartheid. The Palestinian population in Israel stands at 20%. Hence, Israel's discriminatory treatment of Palestinians must be viewed in its totality. As Palestine and other participants demonstrated in their written statements, the system of racial discrimination extends to all areas between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Furthermore, Palestine, Namibia, and South Africa, together with a myriad of public figures, legal scholars, NGOs, concur that such discriminatory treatment amounts to apartheid. Even some Israeli officials admitted it. Although it might not be clear to the naked eye, by Israeli law, Jewish citizens of any country who have never been to Israel can automatically gain Israeli citizenship. Yet, Palestinians, refugees who have spent their entire lives in forced exile and in refugee camps are barred forever from returning to their homelands. Unfortunately, time won't allow me to expose the full extent of Israel's discriminatory laws, but I would only highlight that Israel has an extensive set of laws discriminating against Palestinians in every aspect of life. This was not left unnoticed by CERD, which noted that the practice of segregation between Jewish and non-Jewish communities continues to be applied in Israel proper. A one-state reality of unequal rights, consolidating segregation and apartheid against Palestinians, is reflected in the inherently discriminatory character of the 2018 Basic Law, Israel, the nation-state of the Jewish people. Under this law, exercising the right to national self-determination in the State of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. Developing Jewish settlements became an Israeli national value, not only in the occupied West Bank and the Syrian Golan, but even in Israel. And I ask where? On which lands? The answer is on the lands where Palestinian citizens of Israel live, especially in the Galilee and the Naqab. An exclusive right of one group and complete denial of the rights of another. From the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, if this is not apartheid, what is. Israel's measures, policies and practices against the Palestinian people are no less pervasive in their reach or less pernicious in their consequences than the institutionalized racial discrimination and segregation that existed in South Africa. And just like in 1971, the international community relies on this court to play its own genuine role to bring about an end to this glaring injustice. An immediate end to this illegal situation will bestow on the Palestinian people the fundamental rights to which they are entitled by international law, yet, unfortunately, they have been so unjustly denied. Let me conclude, Mr. President, with a cry of desperation, representing the countless victims of the ongoing Israeli atrocities, as described by the Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti. In my despair, I remember, there is life after death, there is life after death. And I have no problem, but I ask, oh God, is there life before death? Mr. President, members of the court, I thank you for your kind attention. Mr. President, I respectfully request that you now call Professor Sands to the podium. Thank you very much.